Okay, well, it's 6 p.m. on the dot here, Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. So we want to respect folks' time, especially this evening, and go ahead and get started. My name is Donovan Rusaniello. I'm the Outreach Director for Renewable Energy Alaska Project. This is the first installment in our 2025 Spring Energy Speakers Series, and we are thrilled to be co-hosting it with Alaska Common Ground. I'll go just a little bit into who our organizations are and queue us up for this webinar. But first and foremost, want to ground us in the lands that we're on this evening. I'm zooming in from Denaina El Nena here in Anchorage, and just always want to start by reminding folks that the work we do at REAP to accelerate the development of renewable energy and energy efficiency across the state draws immense inspiration from the Alaska Native peoples and those who have stewarded these lands for time immemorial. They've been truly innovative in the way that they've used their local resources for the common benefit of folks here. And so we, of course, draw inspiration from that as we look to the future. But again, I represent Renewable Energy Alaska Project. We're a statewide nonprofit with over 60 dues-paying members, spanning electric utilities, Alaska Native entities, developers, nonprofits, educational institutions, local governments, all committed to that vision and mission of developing renewable energy and energy efficiency across the state of Alaska. If you're interested in learning more about our work, I could share our website as well. But just want to remind you that we represent that coalition of organizations who are working on these efforts. A few housekeeping things, and then I'll hand it off to our co-host here. This webinar will be recorded and made available online afterwards. Common question. Hopefully we knocked that one out from the beginning. As it pertains to other questions, we would encourage folks to use the Zoom Q&A function. That'll make it easier for us to gather those and then make sure they're asked and answered at the end. On that note, we are trying to leave a sizable portion of this evening's webinar for audience Q&A. Both of our speakers are really keen to hear what folks are thinking and wondering and hopefully answer those. So please log those using the Q&A function. And as for the chat function, we'd really hope that folks might just interact there, share what native lands they're zooming in from, and also their name and affiliation, get a bit of engagement there as well. We have a great group of folks already online and have an amazing list of registrants. So I just really want to shout you all out for spending your Wednesday evening with us. On that note, just again, really grateful for Alaska Common Ground co-hosting this event. And so without further ado, I wanted to introduce Mary Lou Harrell, who's a board member of Alaska Common Ground, just to share a bit about their organization and why they're co-hosting this webinar with us this evening.
Thanks, Donovan. I am Mary Lou Harrell on the board of Alaska Common Ground, and we're really happy to co-sponsor this program tonight. And we welcome everybody to the webinar. Alaska Common Ground is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and our goal is an engaged democracy. We focus on public policy issues, including climate and energy policy and legislation. And we strive to educate Alaskans on public policy topics and encourage Alaskans to take action on issues that are important to them. We are a member-supported organization, and you can learn more about us on our website, alaskacommonground.org. And thanks, everybody, for being here and attending tonight. Looking forward to it.
Well, thank you, Mary Lou, and thank you again to Alaska Common Ground. Really grateful for your efforts organizing this event with us and spreading the word about this important topic. And on that note, just really do want to begin diving into this important topic. So I'll introduce our speakers and then hand it off to them to sort of give us their knowledge and expertise on the topic of a renewable portfolio standard and specifically legislation that has been introduced to establish one here in the Railbelt. I'll begin by introducing Representative Kai Holland. He represents Alaska House District 9, which covers South Anchorage, Hillside, and Girdwood all the way to the city of Whittier. He grew up here in Anchorage and has 4 decades of experience as an engineer, business manager, university educator, and consultant. He also has done work in mining, construction, oil and gas, public safety, water and wastewater, and a variety of related industries, including industrial products, training, and technologies. In the community, he's been very active as well on numbers of boards, including addressing homelessness, workforce development, economic development, innovation, and local community engagement. But he's a lifelong Alaskan who's combined his professional experience with a deep commitment to community service and working to solve many of our greatest issues here. And so that's what brings him to this work this evening. Really grateful to have him with us tonight. And then I'll also introduce REAP's executive director and founder, Chris Rose, who many folks online are very familiar with very grateful to have both of them this evening. I will hand it off to Chris initially just to set the scene. And Chris, I'm hoping on the topic of renewable portfolio standards and the one that's been introduced in the state legislature to establish one for the Railbelt, could you please just give us an overview on sort of what RPSs are and a recap of the history for advocacy and development of an RPS here in Alaska?
Sure. Well, good evening, everybody, and many thanks to Representative Holland and Mary Lou and Alaska Common Ground for co-hosting this event tonight. Um, the RPS is a standard that requires utilities to increase the percentage of renewable energy over time, or else face compliance penalties. RPS has been used successfully now in at least 28 states. Some states also have clean energy standards or goals beyond that. In fact, 17 states have a goal of 100% renewable or clean electricity by 2050 or earlier. Hawaii was the first state to establish a standard like that. The utility industry is highly regulated. There are many, many standards that are part of the electric industry. And in fact, I should probably note that I am on the board of directors of the Railbelt Reliability Council, and I'm not in any way speaking for the Railbelt Reliability Council, but the RRC was established by the legislature 5 years ago through legislation to create reliability standards that apply to all the utilities across the entire Railbelt grid, or else those utilities may face fines for noncompliance. So facing compliance fees or penalties is not something new to the electric industry. The other thing that the RRC is doing is actually doing integrated resource planning for the entire grid as a region. That's just beginning now, but that is a really important part of REAP's motivation to get involved in an RPS in the first place. For many, many years until 2020, when the bill that I'm talking about, which established the Railbelt Reliability Council, was passed, utilities in the Railbelt could build generation plants without any regulatory pre-approval. So the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, the RCA, is our regulatory body that oversees the four co-ops in the Railbelt. Until 2020, they had no way to pre-approve any projects. And what happened in the early 2010s, up through about 2013, 14, was many, many new generation projects were built, and we, arguably didn't need every single one of them. And so there was a real push to have regional planning that would look at the entire grid as a region and see what we actually needed. And so the integrated resource planning process is part of the RRC. I'm not speaking or representing the RRC here at all, but that is a really good backdrop to why we are interested in the RPS, because without some kind of an integrated resource plan or another pre-approval process, which has been established now by the legislature, we were concerned that if we developed a standard for renewables, that the projects that might get built would just be whatever project had the biggest political push. Instead, the way that the Senate bill back in 2020 set up the RRC, all new projects either have to go through a technical and economic feasibility study through the IRP process, or has to be approved by the Regulatory Commission in a separate proceeding. So we have a much better idea now that whatever projects do get built, either without an RPS or with an RPS, are going to be technically and economically sound. And so that was really the beginning of when REAP started looking at an RPS as a standard that would be helpful to start pushing the Railbelt utilities toward more renewables. There's been a long history of utilities interested in putting more renewables in and getting off the high reliance on natural gas that we have. But there hasn't been a lot of new renewables built in the last 10 or 15 years. And so a standard is simply an incentive for all the utilities to get together and start working toward bigger projects that have more economies of scale and can start to reduce the heavy dependence on natural gas that we have right now.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful context. And I guess, so you mentioned a renewable portfolio standard is that requirement for increasing percentages of renewables to come from renewable resources. Are there other attributes of an RPS that has been considered then just to sort of round out the understanding of different aspects of the bill that we're talking about this evening?
Well, the biggest attribute of a standard is some kind of compliance or enforcement structure. Otherwise, you simply have a goal. Back in 2010, Governor Palin signed legislation that was passed by the legislature, House Bill 306, which was a energy policy of the state of Alaska. But there was non-codified language that just said we're going to try to get to 50% renewable by 2025. There was no enforcement of that. And so there's no way you can call something a standard unless there is enforcement, unless there is some kind of a consequence for the utilities who are regulated by the standard to actually get there. One of the analogies I often use is none of us really work that well without a deadline. You don't turn in your term paper on time if you don't have a deadline. So this is setting a deadline for the utilities that has compliance consequences. We have a regulatory entity here in the state, the RCA, I already mentioned. The statute typically, or an RPS standard, will typically identify what entities have to be in compliance. In this case, it would be the utilities in the Railbelt, which is where most of the electricity in the state is produced. And the legislation typically will identify and define what are the eligible resources that a utility can use to get to compliance. So in this case, it's renewable energy.
Very helpful. Thank you. And then I guess just for broader context, and then we could finish off with the process so far in Alaska, but can you give us a sense of where else RPSs have been established and whether we know whether they've been helpful or how those have played out?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, 28 states have an RPS already. Most of those states have achieved compliance early and then increased the standard. So, and I guess another thing to point out here is that in every state, the utilities that were going to be regulated by this RPS were against it. So it's not surprising that we're seeing pushback from our own Railbelt utilities on this because usually an entity doesn't want to really push hard to make rules for themselves. That being said, utilities are really good rule followers. And in the 28 states that have had RPSs, we've seen great compliance and very few compliance penalties have been levied in those states. So as I think we know from prior conversations, the cost of wind and solar have come down 80-90% in the last 10 years. The cost of energy storage has come down significantly in the last 10 years. And so now wind and solar in most jurisdictions is the cheapest electricity. So it's much easier for utilities to comply now because it's just the economic right thing to do.
Great, thank you. And of course, the reason that we're hosting the webinar this evening is that RPS legislation has been reintroduced in Juneau, including by our other speaker here, Representative Kai Holland. But just before I hand it off to him to give his reasons for introducing it and his sort of overview on where it's at in the process right now, could you just give us a summary maybe of years leading up to this one, how it's gone down in Juneau when RPS legislation has been introduced and considered so far, Chris?
Sure. As I mentioned, REAP really started looking at the idea of an RPS after we had a bill passed, Senate Bill 123 back in 2020 that created the Railbelt Reliability Council and the integrated resource planning process and pre-approval process. And so we developed a framework for an RPS that the governor then developed into a bill and introduced in the 2022 session, which was the second year of that two-year session. The bill actually passed out of a couple committees that year, but then the session ended. The last 2 years before this session, we had bipartisan and bicameral support. We had a Republican in the House and a Democrat in the Senate who introduced the bill. Didn't go very far in those 2 years. And so this year, we're very pleased that Representative Holland has introduced it in the House and Senator Wielkowski has introduced it in the Senate.
Thank you. And then perfect entree into then Representative Holland. Thank you again for joining us. On that note, and I'll just name it, House Bill 153 is the bill that you've introduced to establish an RPS for the Railbelt. Could you give us a sense for your own motivations and expressing why you think this policy solution is both needed, but then also important in this current moment?
Sure. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you. I'm looking forward to the discussion we're having. I would start off with a couple key issues. First off, as a representative for a House district, my first job is to try and understand the issues in that district and to try and represent them. And I would, offer that in going, from door to door and the campaigning process, I found that energy security in the Cook Inlet and concern about gas supplies was one of the top issues that I ran into consistently. The district, as you covered at the beginning, covers a broad swath of South Anchorage and out to Girdwood and Whittier. But over and over and over again, I heard people are concerned about the news that they had been reading about with short supply of gas in the Cook Inlet. They had heard rumors, particularly coming out of the northern part of the Railbelt, about possible shortages and power problems up there. And they expressed to me a lot of concern about what are we doing to be able to ensure that we have energy for both heating and for electricity in the future. And that backdrop was, a key issue in framing the issues that I had to try and understand how to work on here in Juneau. But I'd also offer, a broader perspective, which is, a lot of the motivation that I bring into this office is looking at the economic development and the economic prosperity. The last 10 years are ones that I've spent working deeply in the innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem. I helped start Launch Alaska back, almost 10 years ago, which got into a lot of the innovation ecosystem and, of course, has really moved into becoming a leader in clean energy projects, but also supporting pilot work in energy technology. And, I've learned about the economic opportunity of job creation, new venture creation, and the local wealth that can be created by harnessing the energy that's available. And I would say then that there's a really interesting intersection that comes together with this, which is that the Cook Inlet, in the last year is now looking primarily at the bridging strategy of bringing in imported liquid natural gas, which all of a sudden subjects our local markets to the uncertainties around the price of that natural gas and what it may do to our energy costs. And it's been fascinating to recognize that what's happening is we're essentially beginning to see what life is like for rural Alaska for many decades that has been struggling with the high cost of energy in rural communities because of the imported diesel. And if we look at the trajectory of our rural communities and their move towards renewable energy and harnessing the renewable opportunities around, whether it's wind or solar, they have learned how to harness the renewable energies that are available and to integrate them into the baseload capability in order to stabilize their price of energy and to set a pathway towards having a greater degree of renewables as a way to reduce their energy costs and to provide alternative energy supplies so that they're not as dependent upon the difficulties of sometimes getting their energy brought in and the volatility of the pricing. So I found it absolutely interesting to see how much we could learn from our rural stories and their challenges, and to recognize that we were moving into that same challenge and opportunity in the Railbelt area. So that's a long, way of saying, I came into this position recognizing that we have a significant concern about, do we have the energy that we need to heat our homes and to power our community? And, do we have an ability to harness our renewable energy as a way to help develop a reliable, affordable solution to the energy that we need here? And how can we learn from what's being done in the rest of Alaska in integrating those different technologies? And one final thing, and then I'll kind of pause for a moment, is that there's some interesting unintended surprises that are coming out of this. One of those, for example, is we've known one of the great challenges with renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, is this variable nature. And it turns out to be one of the criticisms of, is it, consistent? Well, we have, of course, found out that batteries become one of the necessary ingredients. One of the interesting unintended benefits of this pathway we're on is you've now seen the integration of batteries, in the rail belt, and these batteries are now actually cutting the cost of running our rail belt utilities, even while they're still on fossil fuels, simply because they're able to better manage the systems and the power generation. And the path that we're on, I think, is what takes us down the road of creating the kind of economy in the future. I like to relate, the story Wayne Gretzky and skating to where the puck is going, and we know where the puck is going if we think in terms of what's important to the next generation of Alaskans. So I'm excited about energy. I'm excited about the innovation opportunities. And the economic opportunities. And so I got involved in this, with this RPS bill, and being able to bring it forward as a way to help us see, where the white lines are that might take us in a direction that I think actually is going to create a stronger economy and a better energy landscape for the future. But I'm really looking at it as a jobs and economic opportunity as much as I am an energy solution.
Well, really well said. Thank you, Representative. And I'll just say I dropped the link to both bills in the chat there, but the one for House Bill 153, if you navigate over to the document tab, it has a lot of associated, whether it's letters in response to the legislation or slide decks from prior testimony. But the bill sponsor statement from Rep. Kai Holland and his office is a really great overview on exactly what the representative just mentioned. I guess just one follow-up question, and then we could perhaps move on to Chris again, sort of updating us on some relevant analysis. Just, I'm curious, was someone from someone with such a background in business and innovation, I'm curious why you see a policy solution as necessary in this context as well. I think there's been a lot said about, well, if renewables make sense economically, why aren't our utilities just embracing them? And I'm curious for your perspective on that.
It's a really challenging question because I do kind of lean a little bit to the right when it comes to business. And I would like free market systems to be able to be innovative, be able to be free, to be flexible, and that. So I kind of lean towards wanting to kind of let, that innovation happen. But that being said, we're working in a fairly small market with just a few players that have made heavy investments, and the structures have made it so that they're, kind of stuck in terms of trying to, manage the assets that they've invested in, and they should. But I think a really interesting aspect of this also is that we're in an economic time that has been relatively flat for the last 15 years. And if we were in a situation where we had a lot of high growth at this point, I think we'd see the dynamics here quite different in terms of new projects. And we would see, like we see in the lower 48, where, over 90% of new energy projects are renewables. Here in Alaska, I think we'd see more of that if we had the economic growth that was pulling that along. So in this case, we're dealing with an economic situation that I think needs a little more nudging in there. And when I look at this and I debate with myself the question of, when should we start using government and government policies to steer, what we want to see? And I think back on what we've done with, for example, housing construction and insulation codes and requirements, where we've decided that we needed to have more insulation, which costs a little bit more to build the house, but turns out it's more economical to live in the house. What we've done with automobiles, where we've required that they have higher fuel economy, which made it harder for the manufacturers initially, but we've all benefited from the higher fuel efficiency. And the rules that we put in for clean water, clean air, we can see over and over again where the careful, appropriate nudges of public policy move us in a direction that's maybe kind of hard in the moment, but turns out to make the world a better place. And so that's my framing, and that's why I'm working so hard, both with the input we're getting in our testimony, but also with the utilities, to figure out how do we paint these white lines in a general direction that takes us in a way that is going to create a better outcome long-term for us, even though we realize that there's some short-term steps that we have to take that are hard. And all we have to do, as a simple example, is look at the Bradley Lake project. If you go back when Bradley Lake was started, it was incredibly expensive energy, but there was a vision that we needed to move towards the ability to have some hydropower to invest in it. And at that point in time, it was far more expensive than the energy that we could produce from our gas. But now here we are later, and we're looking at Bradley, as the dream project because its power is so affordable, and we're so thankful that that investment was made to move in that direction. That it is now, we wish we had more of it. Sometimes we wish we had other hydro projects. So, I bring that, balance and that tension, if you will, between how much public policy is going to be helpful and moves in the directions there, and how much might be constraining and have unintended consequences. So I'm trying to be careful in this process, trying to listen carefully to the feedback that we're getting to make sure that what we're putting together is something that does move us in a direction that's good for our economy and good for our energy security and affordability. But on the other hand, doesn't leave things just stuck going nowhere and waiting for magic to happen.
That's really helpful. And I guess just to put some numbers on it as well, we've said, there's analysis showing that renewables are not only cost competitive, but there's some analysis showing that renewables, embracing the development of our local renewable energy resources, is that lowest cost path forward for the rail belt. And so to ground us in that, Chris, would you mind, we here at REAP, we cite two NREL studies pretty often, which show that achieving an RPS is technologically feasible and would bring economic benefits. Would you mind giving an overview on those and then also summarizing some more recent analysis commissioned by the utilities, which showed some great findings related to the RPS?
Sure. So in 2021, at the very end of the year, before the governor introduced the first RPS in 2022, he asked the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, which is a national lab that works for the Department of Energy, to tell him whether or not getting to 80% renewable by 2040 was technically feasible, because that was the RPS legislation that the governor introduced in 2022 for us in the Railbelt to get to 80% by 2040. NREL did a very quick study, for them, relatively speaking, a couple months. They did a deep dive and they looked at the resources that the Railbelt has and the opportunities there, and said, yes, absolutely, Governor, the Railbelt can get to 80% by 2040. Then a lot of questions were asked about the economics, of course, and that made a lot of sense. And NREL went back to do a deeper dive on the economics of renewables, and they came back with a study about 13 months ago, a follow-up study that was much more in depth, that talked about the economics of what would happen with a renewable portfolio standard. And they made certain assumptions. One of the assumptions was we were going to start importing liquefied natural gas in 2027, which is by the way, when DNR has been for 16 years projecting that we would start running out of gas. Doesn't mean we're going to be importing all of our needs, but we will begin running short of natural gas in Cook Inlet in 2027. And the price that NREL assumed in their study was $12 to $13 per MCF. Now we're hearing higher prices than that, but the NREL study was assuming $12 to $13. Given that assumption, they looked at the price, the projected price of renewables, and found that between now and 2040, if we were to go toward renewables, that the sweet spot for the Railbelt was actually about 76% renewable. And then if the Railbelt went towards 76% renewable in those 15 years between now and 2040, the gas savings would in aggregate equal to about $1.3 billion for consumers in the Railbelt. And that included a very conservative amount of money that would have to be spent every year to integrate renewables into the grid. So they did not forget about the cost of integration. They looked at batteries, they looked at other things that would be necessary to make sure that the renewables could be integrated seamlessly. $1.3 billion of savings. Prices for renewables have changed since 13 months ago. Prices, they may have gone up, but likewise, the price of natural gas that we're probably going to import has gone up. So we're still looking at a net benefit economically through the NREL work that we've seen so far. We'd like to see an update to that study if we can get it. a more recent study that the Utilities Commission by a national consulting firm called E3 just came out about 2 months ago, and it found it actually was commissioned to look at the ability of the Railbelt to integrate 300 megawatts of wind power. There's about 300 megawatts of wind power being, at least 300 megawatts of wind power now being considered and proposed to the Railbelt utilities. One big project up near Fairbanks, another one closer to Anchorage. And E3 found that absolutely the Railbelt grid could integrate another 300 megawatts of wind, which, by the way, would get us close to 40% renewable in the Railbelt if we built both of those projects. And we could do that without impacts on reliability, without impacts on stability, and without building any new transmission. So I think that was a very significant study. But the most significant part of that study, I think, was the fact that E3 found that in order to do that, the Railbelt utilities would have to work together. They would have to work together toward operating the grid together, toward managing the grid together in one large grid area, rather than having three separate areas where that grid is managed. Right now, we have a north, middle, and south management area, essentially. And the Regulatory Commission of Alaska has seen this as a problem for at least 10 years. They wrote a letter to the legislature dated June 30th, 2015, that laid out a bunch of findings about how the Railbelt should be reformed. Some of those were dealt with in 2020 when Senate Bill 123 that I mentioned was passed. Another was dealt with last year when the legislature passed House Bill 307, which dealt with the pancaking transmission tariffs in the Railbelt grid. So we see this as a natural evolution of policy solutions and policy drivers and policy signals to actually modernize our grid and operate it the way that grids are operated in the rest of the world. For example, if you added up the entire load of the Railbelt, it equals half of a power plant in the lower 48. So we have four utilities managing the equivalent of a half a power plant in the lower 48. That clearly does not sound very efficient. And in fact, E3 found that we are leaving more than $40 million on the table just in inefficient management of the grid because we don't have one single load balancing area and one single operator. So if we have a RPS, it's going to give a huge incentive to the utilities to work together to build more economically, more economies of scale projects, bigger projects. And I think the other policy signal that's going to be really important is to send a signal to developers in the lower 48 that Alaska is open for business for renewables, because this is one of the fastest growing industries on the planet, but we have a small market. And unless we send a signal to larger developers who have access to capital, who have a lot of experience, to come up here, we're going to wind up with this small market with no competition. We have four monopolies. There's no way you can choose where you buy your electricity from. But we believe an RPS could develop an incentive for other developers to come up here and compete with each other to sell power to the utilities, which would be really, really good for consumers. Because as we have looked at just internally at REAP, the volatility that we are about to see with LNG is perhaps even more disturbing than the price. We are definitely going to be paying more for LNG than we are for cooking with gas, but we're going to have a lot more volatility than we've ever had. Even though we've had high-priced gas relative to the lower 48 over the last 30 or 40 years, at least it's been consistently high-priced, and we had some certainty over what the price was going to be. With LNG that is pegged to some kind of world market index, like the Japan spot market, we could see with world events prices jump from year to year, and that's really going to impact consumers. So we really believe that making sure that we have some sidebars around how much LNG we have to import and for how long is important, and RPS will help us do that.
Well, thanks, Chris. I mean, wow, that was a lot of important reasons why an RPS is an important policy solution. I guess just bring us back then to Representative Holland. So the bill was introduced last month. I guess it's been about a month, or it will have actually tomorrow. And a lot has happened since then. So I'm curious from your perspective how things are going, how the bill has started to gain some momentum, what's happening in its first committee of referral, and what your perspective is on this first month that it's been in play.
Sure. Thanks. Well, the last month has been awfully exciting, and I've learned a lot about the process of sausage making with this bill and the impact. And of course, you've also seen in the news our operating budget, our education funding debates, and quite honestly, this bill has been somewhat blown around with the winds of these other activities. So it's been quite a juggle to try and keep the bill moving ahead with the committees. But we did get introduced. We had some great invited testimony, kind of laying out the framework of it, and then we had a really good public testimony period that I was super pleased with in terms of the breadth of feedback that we got. And if you get a chance to go back and look at it, the recordings on the akledge.gov website in there. I'm sorry, I don't have the date right off the top of my head. But if you do a tally there, and I did, of the feedback, we got a really diverse range of folks that were on one hand concerned about the question of, are renewables reliable? Are they going to be affordable? Should the state be mandating things? But we also had people talking about the need for creating investability, of being able to create a way for more utility cooperation, to be able to save our gas, to be able to do more heating in there, to be able to create jobs that come with this. And so we've gotten a great, breadth of feedback, I think, appropriately giving us a good lens into the issues and concerns and opportunities. At the same time, during that period of time, we've had a chance to be working with all the utilities to figure out what their concerns are. So zooming up to where we are, we were supposed to be working on the bill yesterday, but that was preempted with the veto override vote. So we're going to be taking it up tomorrow at 1 o'clock. If folks want to hook up, there's a live feed again on the akledge.gov website. And we'll be looking at amendments on the bill. Of course, we have a CS version, a committee substitute that came in. It took care of some initial changes that we wanted to make. We moved out the first threshold date of 40% by 2032, recognizing that we're in a period of significant uncertainty at the moment in terms of what's happening with the grants and the different policies that will be affecting renewable projects. And we felt like it became necessary to have a little bit of breathing room for those issues to settle out at this point. We also clarified that the fees that would be collected for utilities that didn't hit their targets in 2032 and 2035, that money would stay with the utilities and could be used to help them finance their renewable projects. And that at the end of the day, out 5 years, if that money still hadn't been fully encumbered for qualified renewable projects, that rather than that money just disappearing into the state coffers, we've now got it targeted to go into the state's renewable energy fund in there. And so at any rate, we've made a number of changes that have been helping us incorporate the feedback that we've got. Tomorrow's amendments really run a gambit of looking at different aspects of the bill's impact on ratepayers, and should the ratepayers be asked to be paying for these penalties. And with our member-owned utilities, that's a necessary aspect. If the utilities have to pay some money, it's going to show up on a rate filing and a bill for people to be paying. And so we're working through some amendments there. There's also been a lot of interest in the relative merits of a renewable portfolio standard versus a clean energy. And so you're going to see some amendments that are proposing that we ought to shift a little bit more towards clean energy as opposed to renewables. And what that's really speaking to are the folks who would like to see more opportunity for nuclear, which actually is allowed because the RPS really focuses on a non-fossil fuel. But there's also interest because of the discussions around the idea of having a coal-fired power plant or clean coal. And so folks are looking at having that as an option if that were to happen. So we'll be taking up those amendments tomorrow. It should be a good discussion around these different alternative policies and that. Our intent, though, is to keep the bill moving. Its next step will be to the Resources Committee.
Great, thank you. So I do want to make note of the fact that we're 20 minutes from the end, and we did want to save a lot of time for Q&A. So maybe I'll just make the plug again for folks in the audience. We've got a number of questions logged already, but please remember to use the Q&A function so that we can gather and then make sure and ask your questions. But maybe to just hand it back to Chris then for that outside perspective. Obviously, Representative Holland is the bill sponsor and working it through that committee process. But from the outside looking in, Chris, what's your perspective on the basically the path that the bill has left to go, the work left to be done, and perhaps how folks who are either on the webinar this evening or watching this recording right now can engage to sort of school up and then take action to support the passage of this policy?
Well, we think this is urgent. We have already seen the Regulatory Commission be pretty upset with Homer Electric for not having a gas contract. I think there's a lot of concern that the utilities have not figured out where they're going to get natural gas in the near future. They could easily sign an LNG contract between now and when the legislature reconvenes in January. So we really hope to keep pushing this bill to set some kind of a standard to help frame whatever LNG projects and contracts get signed between now and January. The price of electricity in the Railbelt is about 22 on average cents per kilowatt hour. That's a good 50% higher than the national average. It's 50% more than where we were 10 years ago in the Railbelt. Prices are going up quickly because of natural gas prices going up. We're going to see even more increases in our bills for both heating and electricity if we don't stabilize it through renewables. We know renewables are a proven technology, and we know that we can get a lot of benefit from just operating the grid a lot better and a more unified basis than we are right now. So we have a lot of good reasons, I think, to get this bill moving, in the next month and get it through the Energy Committee, get it to the next committee, which is the House Resources Committee. That's going to be our goal here in the next week or two, is to get it in and out of the Resources Committee after it presumably moves out of the Energy Committee. We're fiercely opposed to making it a clean energy standard from REAP's perspective, because we don't think there is anything like clean coal. I think that's just an oxymoron. Even clean coal projects like the one up at Healy have failed. There's still a lot of mercury, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide emissions, and I think clean is being used euphemistically to assume that we're going to have carbon capture and sequestration and on an economic scale that's never been seen anywhere on the planet yet in Alaska. So we are very concerned because Alaska has about 1/8 of the world's coal, to opening up this standard to in any way incentivize coal. We believe there's a lot of other opportunities here to incentivize renewable projects and renewable technology that is commercial. And as I mentioned before, we really believe that a standard would send a policy signal to developers in the lower 48 to come up to Alaska and to compete and to add some element of competition in a place where there is really no competitive market. So we're asking folks to write letters to the legislators. You can look up on our website or on the legislative website who are the people on the next committee of referral, which is the House Resources Committee. Target those folks for now, or target people who are your own representative and senator if they're not on that committee. Importantly, also talk to your representatives of your local utility. I think Chugach and Golden Valley in particular are really looking, the boards of those utilities are looking closely at this RPS standard, and I think supporting it kind of conceptually, we need them to support it even more strongly. So the legislators understand that at least a couple of the utilities are interested in having these new rules set up so that we can have some success in getting the utilities to work together. Please reach out to REAP anytime you have any questions. We have a lot of information on our website, and I know Donovan will keep that updated as we move along. So thanks for being here this evening.
Well, that was perfect. Yep. And as Chris mentioned, I'll follow up with many resources, including one I'm dropping in the chat here. Always want to promote the awesome work that our members and partners are doing as well. Aaron McKittrick's Alaskan Energy blog has a lot of great analysis on not only the RPS, but the clean coal proposal, and then other priority policies that are working through the legislature. So I just want to reiterate Chris's point that if you subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can do by entering your email at the bottom of every page on our website, that subscribes you to our updates on the RPS and action items there, as well as just other developments in the renewable energy space across Alaska. We will dive into Q&A here, and we've got a bunch to read off from folks in the audience. Before I do so, though, Mary Lou, did you have any thoughts or questions to share with our panelists before we dive into audience Q&A?
I know I'm looking forward to hearing what questions we have from our attendees here.
Well, perfect. On that note, I think there's a few here that we've touched on already, but just to list them off and see if our speakers have anything else to add. The first is, can you discuss how the RPS relates to the work of the Railbelt Reliability Council? Chris, you spoke about the integrated resource planning process and how that would sort of be the way that an enforced RPS would impact collective planning across the Railbelt. Is there anything else you'd like to add there?
Well, I guess it would be really helpful if some kind of a standard like this were passed now before the integrated resource planning process began, because an RPS would really greatly inform the IRP process. We're just getting that IRP process off the ground now. If we get a year into it and then an RPS is passed, it's going to be less efficient than if we could get that policy signal early on.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you. The next one, I think that's just a quick yes, but it says, Rep Holland, is your bill focused just on the utilities in the rail belt?
Yeah, it is at this point in time. The earlier version of the bill did have a loose connection to the rural PCE utilities in terms of some benefit for some renewable energy credits. But that's been taken out with the CS, so it's no longer in there. But I would like to make it, I think explicit that one of the things that we see with this work is we are trying to understand how to manage and hold down the cost of the rail belt, because the benefit to the rural utilities, particularly the PCE communities, is very direct. If we control the cost of our rail belt utilities, it helps keep the PCE benefit to the rural utilities intact. If our cost of energy, goes through the roof, becomes volatile, then it narrows down and leaves the rural communities with less support for them. So it's of mutual benefit that across Alaska, we harness the renewable energy opportunity and we look towards controlling, stabilizing, and trying to reduce the cost of energy on the rail belt. And it has a direct benefit to all of Alaska, specifically the PCE communities across Alaska.
Well said. Thank you. This next one, in the most recent Matanuska Electric Association board meeting that happened on April 14th, MEA's CEO Tony Izzo raised concern that the RPS had not analyzed the required capital costs of bringing renewable projects online to meet renewable targets. This question is, how do you see the RPS incentivizing utilities to invest in capital costs for renewable projects over gas? But I guess maybe just to cue a point that you made, Chris, about some of the analysis that's done, that has been considered. Is that right?
Well, it's definitely been considered in the NREL study. That analysis has been done. But I think the statement from MEA misses the point, which is that we really want to get expert developers in technologies to be the ones who take all the project risk and take all the capital risk. And so what is happening in most of the country right now is independent power producers play a huge role in developing and running power plants, and they just sell the power to the utilities. 45% of all the electricity in the United States now is generated by independent power producers. We need more independent power producers up here who can take those risks, and then we don't have to have our local consumer-owned co-ops take those risks. The co-op simply buys the power, and if a co-op can buy the power at a price that is cheaper than they could generate themselves, that just makes total sense for the ratepayer.
If I can add on one piece of this issue that to me is interesting, and that is that this siloing of capital cost investments that have happened over the last 20 years has created a situation where we have excess capacity because each utility built what they wanted to build to secure their own energy plans. But the net result, because there wasn't that coordination, is now we're sitting heavy on the capital investment. So I acknowledge that some of the utilities are going to have concerns about capital investment in more energy production assets because they've already overinvested in many of the production capacity that they have today. To me, the real answer to this question is also how do we think about beginning to invest in growing our economy and creating the absorption of new demand so that there isn't this question of should we be investing in more energy production assets when we're already sitting on an overbuilt energy infrastructure. It'd be a lot different discussion if we had new demand and we had to build new power producing capacity anyway. And then what you'd see looking at the lower 48 is, 90+% of it's going to renewables anyway. So, to me, this question comes up largely because we're in this kind of stagnant place. And at the end of the day, I really want to work on how do we actually jumpstart the opportunity for growth in this economy so that we're not having a discussion about should we be building more capacity. The question is, how do we build it and what's the best investment? And what we know from the rest of the world and what we know from the lower 48 is that best investment is going to come from renewable projects.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. I think that the world is electrifying. We're going to electric transportation. We're going to electric heat. We already see a lot of heat pumps down in Southeast Alaska. Heat pumps would work in South Central Alaska, especially as the price of natural gas gets higher. So there's a huge benefit to the utilities to be doing more renewables that are cheaper. And we're going to continue to use our natural gas assets into the future. The NREL study looked at the hydro and the natural gas assets we have, and along with the batteries that we would be adding, see that as the perfect complement of resources that we can use to integrate the variable renewables like solar and wind.
This next question, it says, so for constituents in the Railbelt who are representatives who still need the most convincing that an RPS is the best for all of us, it'd be a shame to see another session pass without urgent action on this issue. Any just final points on who folks should be speaking with, in addition to, of course, their representatives down in Juneau?
Well, the chair of the Senate Resources Committee is Senator Kathy Giessel. We hope that the Senate Resources Committee might see this bill even this year. So I think she would be another person we could have folks write letters to. That's going to be the first committee of referral on the Senate side. But I would say beyond those Senate leaders on the Senate Resources Committee, just focus on the next committee at hand, which is going to be the House Resources Committee, and or your local representative if they're not on that committee.
And just kind of a heads up, I'm anticipating that we'll actually see this thing move in parallel. As this thing moves into resources, I'm hoping that we'll see the Senate version of the bill start moving in parallel to this one. And it can be a little confusing if folks haven't followed bills before in terms of having these companion bills that are moving along. But, the intent is to try and move this thing through to the point that it does get past this session if we can. It's a tall order in a short period of time. But if you're following this, you're going to need to potentially watch both bills as they kind of move along in parallel and hopefully come back together again here in a month from now.
Yeah, I actually misspoke just a second ago. The first committee of referral on the Senate side is the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee. Then it would go to Senate Resources. And the chair of the Labor and Commerce Committee on the Senate side is Senator Jesse Bjorkman from Nikiski. So particularly people who live in his district, I think he'd be a good person to send letters to and explain why you support this bill.
Great. I have a comment in here that I think is just relevant to the clean coal discussion that I could read off real quick. It says, just a comment on clean coal for Rep. Holland in this meeting tomorrow. It used to refer to low sulfur coal that did not produce acid rain. Alaska has low sulfur coal. It is now being used to pretend as if it can be low in carbon emissions as well. Technology to remove and sequester carbon from coal plants has not worked well so far. We should not be using the term clean coal in the context of renewables or clean energy. And I guess I would just, again, direct folks back to Erin McKittrick's fantastic blog where she's got a lot of just analysis on, carbon capture, utilization, and storage and its track record elsewhere and sort of the economics that we've heard publicly discussed regarding that clean coal project. Back to
If I can, just to clarify that, I'm not suggesting that I'm advocating for clean coal. I'm just telling you what the amendments are because I want you to be informed. And if you hear about these things, you'll want to research them because I absolutely agree with the concerns on that. But the fact is, there is a thing called, clean energy standards. There is clean coal, and those are some of the amendments that we're going to see. So I just want people to be aware of that. But it's not to say I'm advocating for them.
No, I'll just say from my perspective, I really appreciate you like doing such a great job of sharing information with us that then we should be acting on and supporting legislation or ideas that we promote individually. Another question, what are you hearing from Chugach Electric Association as far as changes they'd like to see to the RPS bill or their stance on it more broadly? And I guess just on that topic, I know that currently, as we speak right now, Chugach Electric Association is holding their regular monthly board meeting where on the agenda, as I saw earlier, they're considering a resolution taking a stance on the RPS legislation. So we're hoping to share updates on that with folks once we've got more. But
Yeah, just two quick comments. One is I want to make a plug for all of the hard work that Shayna Kilcoyne is doing. She's a staff here in my office, and many of you probably have worked with her in different areas. And I just think the world of her and the work that she's done. She's really the subject matter expert in my office here. I've learned a lot from this. I'm a champion for economic development and technology and new jobs on that. She has really worked hard coordinating with the utilities on that. I will offer as far as specifics around one utility or another. We're really trying to be very respectful of the utilities that are being fairly transparent with their concerns so we can have some open discussions with that. But I'm not jumping into anybody's specific concerns at this point while we work through the sausage making.
Right. There's a next one here, which I think is perhaps a reference to prior iterations of the bill as well. So an important clarification. But this one says, is there any relationship in policy or practice with the bill to move annual net metering for solar, for example, instead of the currently monthly structure? So I know prior iterations of the bill might have included that sort of language. Any updates there?
Yeah, there's been a couple different bills that are out there that have some interest and potential overlap. There's net metering. There's been the community solar, um, 15 megawatt carve out for some of those projects. There's been some right of way issues for utilities, and we've been looking at those different issues in terms of do they have a role in an RPS bill and do they have a place in helping move this bill forward. At the end of the day, I'm trying to keep this bill fairly tightly focused in on the goals and the benefits of an RPS and trying to be careful not to bring in other issues that may have different constituents and different interests in that area. So, yeah, we're watching those issues, but I think you'll see that the governor's net metering bill will probably stay as a standalone bill, and some of these other issues we're watching will stand alone. But if at some point it turns out that there's some benefit to tying together for policy or practicality, we will. But right now, I'm also just trying to focus in on the steps ahead in the next 4 weeks.
Donovan, I can add that one of the provisions in the RPS is that there's a compliance multiplier. In other words, extra credit given to utilities toward compliance if they do a couple of things. One is to work together on large wind projects over 100 megawatts, but the other one is to give them double credit for any rooftop solar that is built in their service area. And so if an annual net metering bill were passed, and that's House Bill 164, the governor's bill separately, that would still have an impact on the incentives for people to do solar and could conceivably help the utilities in their compliance because more people would be doing it, and then the utilities would get double credit for what their customers install.
Great. Well, I guess on that note, it's just, again, a reminder that there are many details within this bill, which of course Rep. Holland and folks who work here on the policy team at Reaper are following closely and trying to keep folks updated on. So please try and engage with us and stay up to date via our communications. There are a few other questions here regarding, I might lump one of these together. There's one just about, commercial demand drivers and trying to build that load in the Railbelt. Rep. Holland, I'm just curious if you have any final points on your vision for like how we can sort of build this future together while incentivizing the development of our local renewable energy resources and just sort of the future of the system at large.
That's a big question. What I will say is that, some folks have talked about data centers. I think it's a fanciful, great idea. I'm not sure, I'm not personally sold yet that it's real, but I am looking at how do we create some new commercial demand. I think there's a lot more opportunity though in heat pumps and automobile, electrification opportunities that are nearer term direct benefits for us there. But we'll be looking at more of those benefits that we could bring into that. I'll also point out that I am particularly, surprised and impressed with the work that the Bureau of Ocean Engineering Management or Energy Management has come out with in terms of the real puck, if you will, down the road is in the hydrogen production that comes out of the excess energy that we have for producing and exporting hydrogen. And my own view, and this is maybe kind of, big picture, but, I believe that Alaska's future is to continue to be an energy exporter. But as we look out 50 or 100 years, the energy of the future is going to be hydrogen in some form, whether it's hydrogen itself or whether it's shipped out as ammonia for the maritime fleet. And we have such immense renewable energy just in South Central, whether it's the tidal energy, the wind energy, the solar energy. Are harnessing that. We are an energy state. We can be an amazing energy state of the future. So to me, the RPS is actually just that first step into a new energy transformation that we're going through that's going to set us up like you see in King County right now in Washington, where they're starting to take some of the excess renewables moment to moment and they're running through an electrolyzer to make a little bit of hydrogen for their hydrogen hub. They're creating a market. They're going to need more hydrogen. Japan and Korea are already taking all of the hydrogen they can find. The market is there. So I'm looking at where the market is going in there. I also know that we're going to run short on time. I want to remind folks, if you go to the akledge.gov website, at the bottom, you can put in the bill numbers and it will send you text messages anytime the bills are moving. It's an incredibly great way to get a real-time update on the bills. And I'll just note that the Senate version of the bill is SB 149. And of course, the House one is 153, but that's a really cool tool for following bills.
Perfect. Well, I guess I couldn't have summed it up any better. Chris, any final remarks before we close out and sort of tease our next webinar?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Rep. Holland for being here and Alaska Common Ground for co-hosting. Great discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to continue it.
Well, on that note, thank you, all three of you, Chris, Rep. Holland, and Mary Lou, for co-hosting, organizing, and sharing your expertise and time with us this evening. Also, thank you to the audience. Obviously, it's a Wednesday evening where you had many other things that you could be doing and many other ways to spend your time. Really appreciate you digging in on this important policy solution that, as Rep. Holland said, could really help us to sort of launch into the future of our energy system in a way that helps all Alaskans to thrive, keeps energy costs low and stable, and provides those economic opportunities for the long term. Again, just want to remind folks that REAP is a nonprofit organization that does a lot of this work with the support of individual donors and just folks who are aligned with our mission. And so if you share our mission and vision for the future of Alaska's energy system, please consider learning more at our website, and also consider donating to support this work, which, unfortunately is increasingly difficult to fund given the current circumstances. But we also, as I mentioned at the top, a membership-based organization, and many other organizations are a part of our coalition, pay dues to be a part of REAP. And so if you and your organization would be interested in joining us, please reach out and check out that webpage in the chat. And finally, thank you again to Alaska Common Ground for co-hosting, dropping the link to their website in the chat there, but really grateful to Mary Lou and to everyone on their team who helped us to bring this together. Great turnout, a lot more folks who registered and weren't like you all who dedicated their Wednesday evenings, but again, we recorded this and we'll be broadcasting out more broadly. So please stay in touch. We'll follow up with more information. And as I mentioned, 2 weeks from today during the lunch hour from noon to 1, we'll have our next speaker series webinar with Phil White from UAF, talking about his paper on the history of generation and transmission build out in the Railbelt. So again, a sort of an overview on how we've gotten to where we're at today. But on that note, I'll let you all go. Thank you again for your time. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Alaska Common Ground, and we'll see you all again real soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.